Hey guys, Coach Connor here with another episode of the 10-Minute Strength Pod. Today we're going to be talking about the dynamic effort method, but before we get into that, just a couple announcements here. Like I said in the last one, we made it through the hurricane. Nothing crazy. I know a lot of people kind of south of us were not nearly as fortunate. I was down driving in Brandon the other day, which is about a 20-minute drive from here, and it's like a different world. We were very fortunate up here, but like I said, if you are inclined to keep people in your prayers, I'm sure the people down on Sanibel Island, Sarasota, even Brandon, Lakeland, Kissimmee, Fort Myers, Naples could use it. And if you're able to donate to one of those causes, I would implore you to, because a lot of those people right now have absolutely nothing. All right, the next announcement is that we're actually going to be changing the name of this podcast, and we're going to be changing where it's hosted. So right now it's called the 10-Minute Strength Pod. It's powered by Lyons Den Sports Performance, and we are going to be moving it to be part of the Strength Coach Institute brand, which is going to be a little bit different, and we're going to be changing the name to Strength Coach Rants. Now, the reason for that is because I think it's going to allow me to kind of talk to strength coaches as opposed to kind of straddling this line of talking to like parents and talking to strength coaches, where I don't really feel like we have like a direction. I think that's going to give us a lot more of a direction. It's going to kind of take the handcuffs off of me and allow me to talk about things the way that I want to without it, being worried about me using foul language being associated with my brand and my gym's brand rather, and all of that. So within the coming weeks, probably early next month, it will be called Strength Coach Rants, and we'll let you know when that happens. And it will be being hosted on the Strength Coach Institute website as opposed to the Lyons Den Sports Performance website. So just a heads up, I think it's going to be a good thing. I think you'll enjoy the podcast a lot more. I think I'll enjoy doing it a lot more because, again, I'll just get to kind of get in front of a mic and rant about things without having to worry about it being associated with my gym where I work with kids as young as like 7, 8 years old. All right, so back to the task at hand. Today we're going to be talking about the dynamic effort method. Now, you may have heard of this method, especially if you've been around any of my blogs. I write about it fairly often, or at least mention it and talk about it quite a bit. It's part of a conjugate template. It's a method that's utilized within that template. A conjugate template is more of an undulating type periodization, meaning that we're not in specific blocks at any given time. We're consistently training for size, speed, strength, all at the same time, and this dynamic effort method kind of fits within that. All right, so a long time ago at Westside Barbell, Louis Simmons created the conjugate method. Now, he utilizes what's called the max effort method, which we've talked about. There's another video that we did just a couple weeks ago with that. It's a max effort method, the dynamic effort method, and the repeated effort method. And for the purpose of today's episode, we're going to be talking about the dynamic effort method and how it can be kind of tweaked and modified to use with athletes. So if you're someone that knows much about the dynamic effort method, then you're probably sitting there thinking to yourself, this is actually a great method for athletes, like what needs to be tweaked and what needs to be modified. And we'll go over that, but before we do, we're going to talk about what the dynamic effort method truly is. It's moving submax weights with maximal speed. Now at Westside, they utilize typically, when you read what they've written, it's between like 50 and 60%, plus about 20 to 25% accommodating resistance in the form of bands or chains. Again, we'll go over that, but I modify it quite a bit when using it with athletes, especially athletes with lower training ages. A lot of strength coaches will say, well, you shouldn't use it with athletes with lower training ages, and I say that's absolute nonsense. You can, and we'll talk about that why moving forward. All right, so dynamic effort method. Submax weights, meaning below 90%, moved for maximal speed. The speed that we're looking for is about 0.8 meters per second. All right, that's moving quite a bit. It's about 2.5 feet per second. And in its truest form, you're going to be using accommodating resistance. Now, what is accommodating resistance? It's bands or chains. I'm sure you've seen people put chains or bands on a bar and not really understood the purpose of it. We're going to talk about the purpose of that accommodating resistance today as well. But it typically uses accommodating resistance in addition to the weight that's already on the bar. Like I said, it's part of an undulating program. There are no like dynamic effort blocks really to speak of. We just utilize it with the squat, bench, and deadlift as part of our main movement. No matter what like focus block we're in, it gets utilized. All right, so now that you've got like a little bit of an understanding of what the dynamic effort method is, at least on the surface, we're going to talk about some of the benefits. So Probably the biggest benefit is speed, right? So we're learning to move submax weights with maximal speed. There's going to be like a very big adaptation to speed here because you're putting yourself in a position where you have to be fast in order to move this weight. That's going to carry over to the field of play. And the second biggest one is what's called rate of force development. Now, what rate of force development is being able to generate like a lot of force in as short a period of time. So that's incredibly handy for athletes. Think of yourself going from being stood still to having to move really fast, being able to decelerate and change direction, being able to accelerate. Like rate of force development is a very important aspect of sports, and the more kind of the higher, right, that your rate of force development is, the faster that you're able to recruit those muscle fibers, the faster you're going to be when you're sprinting, when you're changing directions. You'll be able to jump higher. There's a ton of benefits to it. So speed, increased rate of force development, speed endurance as well. So, and we'll talk about this, like the way they do it at Westside is between 7 and 12 sets of 1 to 3, depending on what the movement is. And you're going with about 45-second rest periods, right? So if you are going as hard as you can for 1 to 3 reps and you're getting 30 to 60 seconds of rest, right, you're going to have to adapt to being able to do that over and over again. Now, your effort level is going to dictate, as it always does, like how well like you adapt to this and what kind of, you know, speed endurance you're able to create or generate or adapt to. But having those short rest periods with that maximal type effort is going to have a ton of benefits to you on the field, whether you're talking about, you know, let's say a really good example here is a pitcher, right? So a pitcher only has to be 100% for like a very, very short period of time. And then they get a little bit of recovery, and they got to do it again, a little bit of recovery, and then they got to do it again. And this method, while there will probably be a lot of coaches who probably don't think it's the best thing in the world for a pitcher to be doing a dynamic effort bench press, I will say that that's absolute nonsense. I think the carryover from those short rest periods and that maximal force production is absolutely specific to baseball, right? There's even studies that show, and these are correlative studies, right? So we don't have any real data to say like this equals this, but what we do know is that athletes who are more powerful on the bench press throw the ball harder or throw the javelin harder, overhead athletes. So there's direct correlations. Now, do we know if people that throw the ball fast are just better at the bench press, or it being better at the bench press and producing more speed in the bench press carries over to the pitching? We don't really know, but I will say, like, real quick bouts of generating force, that quick rate of force development with relatively short rest periods is going to, I mean, there's no more specific, outside of pitching, there's no more specific conditioning that you can do for a pitcher. All right, so speed, rate of force development, right, which is good for everybody, and speed endurance. In addition to that, like your overall endurance levels, you know, they're going to increase because you're getting those short rest periods and you're having to go as hard as you can. The heart's going to adapt in a good way. It's a great thing. And the last benefit that I'll go over here and touch on is just rehearsal of movements, right? So if we're doing anywhere from like 20 to 30 reps, right, at this given intensity, that's 20 to 30 reps, and it's submax, right? So you're able to move it. It's 20 to 30 extra reps every single week. Like if you 52 weeks in a year, 20 extra reps, that's over 1,000 extra reps. You're going to get really good at the movement, and I think that's an absolute win and an absolute benefit. All right, so now we're going to talk about accommodating resistance, right? So that can be bands or chains. They're, you know, in its truest form, dynamic effort work is going to have that accommodating resistance. I know not everybody has band pegs in their racks or is able to utilize, you know, band tension or even chains, right? Because they get kind of costly. So it's not an absolute necessary component, but I would say if you're unable to utilize accommodating resistance, and we'll talk about how to kind of modify it, you know, if you don't, I think it's a huge disservice to the training itself, right? There's so many benefits to the accommodating resistance. For one, it pushes the intensity up, right? So we can take a load that's 60% and we can make it 85, right? So as your leverages increase in that lift, right? So think of yourself squatting in the very bottom, right? That's the hardest part of the lift. Where does it get easier? It gets easier as you stand up, right? So if you were to do a box squat with 50% of your overall max, right, and you didn't have accommodating resistance, at some point in time, you would have to slow yourself down so you didn't just jump up off the floor. You wouldn't be able to continuously produce force through that entire range of motion because the movement itself would become really dangerous. So you'd be really powerful out of the bottom, and then that whole, like, probably top third of the movement, you'd be slowing yourself down. So we wouldn't get the overall benefit of training through a full range of motion. So these bands and chains too, I'm a much bigger fan of bands, but you can utilize chains as well. These bands force you to continuously drive force into the ground as you stand up with the weight, right? So on the bottom, it may be closer to 50%, and at the top, it's 85%. So there's no place in that range of motion where you're able to relax. So like that's a huge benefit of that accommodating resistance. And I will say, like, when I utilize the dynamic effort method and my own training, owning a gym and having as much clientele as I do, I don't always have a ton of time to train. I don't always have like an hour to be able to work up to like what my heaviest squat is to be able to train maximally. So I utilize the dynamic effort method quite a bit for myself. It keeps me feeling good. It keeps me under heavier loads. It keeps me powerful so that when I demo, like, everything looks the way it's supposed to. I will say, utilizing the dynamic effort method for bouts where I'm not utilizing the max effort method, it makes that top part of the movement a whole different kind of world. Like, I'm able to accelerate all the way through the top end kind of range of the motion when I'm up at 95, 100 plus %. And that's like such a huge benefit. So, you know, it takes away the deceleration process of a movement, right? So we can take the squat and make it very similar to a clean, right? With a clean, you're never, when you're working at like higher percentages, you're never slowing down. You have to generate force and hit triple joint extension through the entire range of motion, right? With a squat, you wouldn't be able to do that. But hey, we throw these bands on and all of a sudden now you're getting all the way through your hips and knees. Now, we don't hit triple joint extension with a squat because we're not getting up on our toes, or at least the goal is not to get up on our toes. But we're able to generate force at the top of that movement and kind of mimic what we would be doing during a clean without having to teach the athlete to clean. And I think that's a great thing. It also kind of locks you into a bar path, right? So the bench is probably the best way to kind of demonstrate that, because with the squat, there's a little bit of movement. Bar path isn't always straight up and down, but with the bench, it can lock you in to like any given bar path, and that's a win as well. That's going to help you become more efficient at the movement. That's going to help you become better at the movement, which makes our training that much better, right? So it takes away the deceleration process. It increases the load as your leverages get better within the lift. And it's going to help you learn the movement because your reps are going to be locked into being like perfect reps. So when it comes to movement selection for the dynamic effort method, I mean, you can really use whatever movements you want. I will say it's probably a better idea to stick with like the main three movement that you're basing all of your other movements on. For instance, the three big movements that my athletes like, that's our total driver, like what we're trying to get up, is the box squat, and we utilize that as a hinge. The hex bar deadlift, and we utilize that as a squat pattern, all right? And then the bench press. So for us, those are the three lifts that we utilize in the max effort method. We don't get into like board presses or any of that other stuff. That's all kind of special exercises that we don't really change all that much. So we utilize it on the bench, we utilize it on the box squat and the hex bar deadlift. Again, those are like our main movements. For like a power lifter, you're probably looking at and when I say bench, it's a fat bar bench. The fat bar bench is like our go-to bench press here. I like it for a lot of reasons. I like it better than a traditional barbell bench for a lot of reasons. But we utilize a fat bar. We utilize a box squat with a power bar as one of our main movements, and a hex bar deadlift off of blocks. We're talking about probably 2-3 inches off the ground. So those are our three movements that we utilize it with. We don't get too crazy with it. I don't utilize the dynamic effort method with like a Swiss bar press, which also may be in their rotation, or an incline dump or barbell press, or a safety bar box squat, or a camber bar box squat, or like a rack pull or something like that. You want to keep it kind of to the movements that you're trying to drive up. All right. And I'll go into like why we utilize these movements. So for one, I like the fat bar bench for athletes better. There's a little bit more leeway in the bar path. It's a little bit safer of a movement. The bar is actually lighter than a traditional bar most of the time because they're hollow. I like the box squat as our hinge. And a lot of people might fight me on that, but that's a hinge pattern. That is not a squat pattern. There is a, think of it like a sumo deadlift. That's what a box squat should and does look like. And then we utilize a hex bar deadlift as our squat pattern, and that's a bottom loaded squat that looks that looks more like a traditional squat than a box squat does. It's much more anterior chain heavy, whereas the box squat is substantially more posterior chain heavy. So those are the three movements that we use. Instead of a deadlift, we use a box squat. Instead of a barbell squat, we use a hex bar deadlift off blocks, and we actually pull out of the rack. And then instead of a bench press, we utilize like a fat bar bench. So if you're a power lifter, right, you may not want to do those things. You may want to utilize it with like a regular squat or a squat to a box, right, because you want to unload some of that weight in the bottom and work on that rate of force development. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the same setup as like a traditional box squat. A traditional deadlift would probably be a better choice for you as well if that's the total that you're trying to drive up. And then obviously like a power bar competition grip bench press would probably be the right selection for you. But the movements that you want to use, again, are the main lifts of the movements that you're trying to drive up. We don't use it with a regular squat. I don't like it for a lot of reasons, but the biggest reason is that's barely even in our rotation. Like our regular squats are actually part of like our assistance or accessory work here at the Lyons Den. We don't use it as a main movement. And maybe in another podcast, I'll go over why we do it that way. But that's what we use. Use your main three movements that you're trying to drive the totals up in. That's what you want to utilize with this method. All the special exercises and the variations can be utilized within like a repeated effort method and a max effort method. But for the dynamic effort method, you want to keep it just as true as to the movements that you're trying to drive up. All right, so now you've got a better understanding of what this method is. Now you probably want to know, how do I incorporate this into my training? And truth be told, it doesn't have to be within like a Westside influence or a conjugate template. This can go into really any undulating program. And the difference between like a block type periodization and undulating periodization is essentially like the goals of the day, right? Like in a block type training, it's all like a progressive overload. You're in blocks for 4 to 6 weeks that are based on like growth or speed or strength or whatever the case is. With an undulating program, you're hitting all those different variables at different days throughout the week. So you may have like higher intensity days, lower intensity days, and those correlate with like lower volume and higher volume days. You may have days where you focus on bar speed, etc. But it can be incorporated on a speed day into any undulating program. And to be completely honest, if you have lower kind of training age athletes, this can be included in like a higher intensity strength day, right? Because we're talking the top end. If we're using accommodating resistance, the top end of this is going to be like 80 to 85%, right? So that's a higher intensity movement. There's going to be some strength benefits to that. So this doesn't have to be part of just a Westside influence template. You don't have to also incorporate the maximal effort method and the repeated effort method. You don't have to lift like a power lifter. This can be one of your main movements on whatever lift you're trying to drive up during that time, or whatever part of your body you're wanting to focus speed on. This can be incorporated just into that undulating program at any point throughout the week. Just remember, like, it's a higher intensity lift. It takes a little bit more out of the athlete, so you're going to have to make adjustments within your training. I would say, like, you wouldn't want to hit like a dynamic effort day and then the next day hit like something max effort, or a max effort day and then the next day hit something dynamic effort method, because like your CNS is not going to be super recovered. And also don't forget, most of your athletes aren't power lifters. Like, they are they're athletes. They're out on the field. They have to practice. They have to play. Like, there are a million other things that they have to do. They don't have to drive up their total. They have to get faster, and that's what this is for. All right, so it can go into any undulating program. It can obviously be part of like a Westside influence template or a conjugate program. But just remember, when you're programming this, again, the intensity is higher at the top end range of the motion. This dynamic effort method isn't going to take out of you what like 95 to 100% is going to take out of you, but it's going to take a lot out of you. So you need to coordinate lower volume days or lower intensity days around these dynamic effort days to make sure that your athletes are fully recovered and able to not only like stay in the gym and train and get the most out of them, but to get on the field to practice and obviously to play games as well. All right, so now we're going to talk about what's arguably probably the most important part of this podcast episode, which is the parameters, or like the way that you're going to load this. All right, so with most of my athletes, I start off with like a typical Westside style wave when it comes to their dynamic effort work, and typically we only utilize it in the box squat. With my lower training age athletes, we actually started with the hex bar deadlift. But for my athletes that have a higher training age, we actually only utilize it within the squat, and we focus on kind of more maximal type strength when it comes to the deadlift. After we get through that initial like 50, 55, 60, all right, and then we'll go back 55. That's usually week 4. And then they get like what's considered like a deload, where we just take the speed work out for a week. After we go through that, we start adjusting kind of the intensities based on what they're going to need. I've got kids that are going to, NHL camps like midsummer. I've got kids that are going to OHL and USHL camps midsummer. I've got basketball and baseball players that are doing showcases all summer. So it really depends on where they are in their training as to like what's going to happen with that overall intensity and accommodating resistance. Ooh, sorry, that was kind of gross. So as we get like into the kind of the meat of the training, that like the summer, like the mid of the summer, if they don't have anything crazy coming up, we typically stick to just 5 sets of 5, all right, with about 20% of accommodating resistance, especially on the squat. With the younger kids, we keep it kind of closer to maybe 60 to 70%. Because we are trying to increase the overall intensity and drive their strength levels up so that we can benefit more from the speed work. But with the higher training age athletes, we probably stick still between like 40 and 55% for 5 sets of 5. Now, some of that is done because I feel like I'm getting more out of them if I limit them to 5 sets. 12 sets is a big ask of most kids to get underneath a bar, walk it out, squat it twice, walk it back in, wait 45 seconds, go again. And so we'll peel back the intensity so we don't go up to like 60, 65%. We stay like 40 to 50, maybe 55%. And that like allows me to get more out of the athlete. We're also able to get through that speed work or that dynamic effort work in like 7 or 8 minutes after they've warmed up. So it's a win-win. It also more closely mimics what they're going to need on the field to play, right? So an athlete doesn't need to be powerful twice. There's absolutely, outside of like pitching and hitting in baseball, tennis, serving, golf, swinging, outside of that, like there is not a point in any athletic event where, throwers too, that you're going to need to be fast once or twice. These athletes, when they accelerate 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, steps. So we need to train them in a manner that's going to kind of be conducive with them accelerating and changing direction and all that kind of stuff. Remember, when it comes to your athletes, the goal of this is not to drive up totals. The goal of this is to increase bar speed, right, as they get stronger. So if I've got an athlete that can, move 250 plus, another 100 pounds in band tension on the squat, they're going to jump higher, right? They're going to run faster. I'm not worried about what their totals do. I am more worried after we get to like a specific point, focusing on how we can increase that bar speed, how we can add a little bit of accommodating resistance so that it's harder in the bottom, so they can get faster and get stronger. Again, the goal is not to drive up their totals, and I think a lot of strength coaches miss this. Athletes love to see their weights go up, but what's the difference between my 180-pound hockey player that squats 325 pounds versus a kid or that same kid rather, squatting 150 pounds, right? There's not all that big of a difference, but what I can do, right, is start to increase the bar speed at those sub-max weights with that kid who already squats 325, and that's going to be way more beneficial to me than trying to drive that total up. So as a strength coach, kind of get your head out of, we want to drive up totals. Like, that's a byproduct of us trying to get faster with this weight. All right, so we go 5 sets of 5. That's with the bench, that's with the squat, that's with the deadlift. As we get closer to the season and these kids have to perform, we start increasing the overall volume, right, and keeping the rest periods relatively low. So we may go as light as like 30-35% on a squat or a deadlift. And I prefer to do this with the deadlift because to ask 6 to 8 reps for speed out of somebody in a squat and stay in position on a box is a big ask. Towards that part of the year, we'll tend to kind of migrate towards keeping the squat like a strength-based exercise and creating kind of a speed-based exercise out of the deadlift. So we'll go, start off 5 by 5, right? Then we'll go 5 by 6, then we'll go 5 by 7, then we'll go like 4 or 5 by 8. And as we do that, we go like from 50 to 45, or sorry, we'd be up here, 50 to 45 to 40 to 35. And they're having to generate a ton of force over and over and over and over again with minimal like 30 to maybe 45-second rest periods, right? So they're going to adapt to that in a super kind of beneficial and positive way, right? And that's going to help them on the field of play. So again, after we get through like just the generic kind of progressive overload early in the offseason, we start to kind of morph this to what this athlete's going to need. I will say this, I don't do a ton of dynamic effort bench work with most of my athletes. I just don't think it's like beneficial to the vast majority of them. We incorporated some, but for the most part, these kids aren't all that strong. I've got, a couple 250 to 275 pound benchers, but most of those kids who are benching less than that aren't going to benefit a ton from the speed work yet because they're just not strong enough. So what we do with those guys and gals is we just rotate 2 different bench movements in throughout every cycle. So instead of like a close grip bench or an incline press on their modified max effort day, and then a speed bench on their dynamic effort day, we'll do like a regular bench press one day, right? And that's done at a specific intensity. We usually will operate between like 70 and 80% and try to focus on bar speed. And then their maximal effort day, which would, be a modified max effort day, we'll do another variation of the bench, and that's done for strength, right? So we can focus on bar speed with the main movement with these athletes that don't have a super high training age and aren't that strong. We can just incorporate like an extra bench day where the focus is bar speed. All right, so I feel like I went 17 different directions there, but to kind of wrap that up, or at least this part of the podcast, to try to wrap that up, start off, generic, like 56 or 50, 55, 60, back down to 55 for 8 to 12 sets, right? And that's going to lay a foundation for your athletes. That's going to help increase their work capacity. That's going to help with their conditioning. That's going to help with their speed production. And the early parts of their training, it will kind of add to that total to help drive that total up, because we're still getting, a bunch of reps at what would be considered 75 to 85%. Right, so as you kind of shift closer to the season and when they have to perform, you can manipulate those variables, drop the intensity down, crank up the volume, decrease the rest periods based on what they're going to need for sport. All right, so it doesn't have to be like this typical 10 sets of 2, 45-second rest periods, 50% plus 25%. But it doesn't have to be that. You can manipulate this into whatever you want it to be. And obviously, as the intensity goes down and the volume goes up, the bar speed will more than likely be faster than what we're looking for. But again, remember, this is not designed to increase their total. This is designed to allow them to become faster, all right, and increase that speed endurance. All right, so moving on, as far as parameters go, what if I don't have accommodating resistance? Can I utilize this method? And the answer is kind of yes and kind of no. So You're not going to want to be at 50 to 60%. As we've talked about, your athlete's going to have to decelerate that bar at some point in time, right? Due to the fact that like you're moving the weight at some point in time, it's going to weigh substantially less than what it does at the bottom, right? So we don't want to use straight bar weight of 50 to 60%. Now you can probably do that fairly early on in an athlete's training age. Once they've gotten, like relatively proficient at the movement, or at least they're to a point where they're not going to hurt themselves, and their loads are high enough to be able to kind of work at different percentages. You could probably do a block where your focus, like on the bench, is 10 sets of 3 at 50%, or you'd probably be closer to 10 sets of 3. It puts 30 reps. 10 sets of 3 on the bench, and the goal is speed. But at some point, that's going to wear itself out, right? You're not going to be able to do that forever. So how do I kind of change this method to be able to use when I don't have accommodating resistance? And the answer is, like, you really can't. So what you end up doing is doing something called compensatory acceleration training. And all this is it's the dynamic effort method without like those bands and chains and accommodating resistance. We just push the overall intensity of the lift up, right? So instead of working between 30 and 60%, we're now probably in that 65, 70 probably at the low range, 70 to 85%, and the focus of the movement is bar speed. Now, it's not going to move as fast, like just it can't move quite 0.8 meters per second. But what you can do is focus again on the bar speed. You can move that bar with intent, right? The dynamic effort, repeated effort, and max effort methods, right? What is the one word that's in all three of those methods? It's effort, right? So if our effort is to try to be fast, we're going to adapt to that, right? The weight might not move quite like almost 3 feet per second, right? But the effort that it takes to try to get it to move that way is going to have a profound impact on your athlete's ability to kind of generate force, increase rate of force development, and move the bar with intent, right? So that's going to have carryover. So if you don't have accommodating resistance, it doesn't mean that this method isn't for you. It just means that the actual intensity of the lift has to be a lot higher for you to be able to benefit from like what we're trying to get out of it. You can move, like, let's say we give an athlete 50% on the bench and we're like, all right, we're going to do 10 sets of 3. Like, that athlete's going to absolutely be able to crush that bar coming off their chest, and they're going to have to slow down near that end range, right? Squat's the same thing, and it's a little bit more dangerous in a squat because we don't want these athletes coming off the ground. So what we have to do is increase that intensity. We're still going to have to decelerate at the end range of motion, but you can apply a lot more force through that like first 3/4 or like 2/3 of that range of motion before we get there. So while not like ideal to not have accommodating resistance, you can absolutely use like the same effort levels and have some of the same benefits by just increasing the overall intensity. And when you do that, the volume is going to stay the same, right? Because these, like when we are using accommodating resistance, we're actually still kind of falling within like Prilepin's chart, right? If you look at the intensities of dynamic effort work, it actually like correlates right with what's the 20 to 25% above it. So like at 50%, we're at 75%. We're still hitting like upwards of 25, 30 reps. And that, again, correlates with Prilepin's chart. So when we increase like that overall percentage, right, with just straight bar weight, we're not actually changing the overall intensity. So the volume can stay the same. You just have to increase the overall load on the bar to be able to benefit, to relatively the same degree that you would if you had accommodating resistance. So again, while it's not ideal, you can absolutely benefit from doing that. All right, so now we've gone over what the dynamic effort method is, how to incorporate it, the parameters with and without accommodating resistance. So hopefully you've gotten a really good idea and understanding of how to utilize it. Different times of the year, you can manipulate it in different ways. Remember, this is not like an attempt to drive up totals for athletes. This is an attempt to create more bar speed, have them increase their rate of force development, be able to generate a ton of force in as short amount of time as possible, and train through a full range of motion. So like kind of forget like why Westside Barbell uses this method because with athletes, it's completely different. So the bar speed doesn't have to be the exact same. The resistance doesn't have to be the exact same. The intensities, loads, volumes, rest periods, you can manipulate all those things in an effort to kind of create an environment that's going to allow your athletes to adapt to the stressors that are going to have carry over to their sport. So while like a sprinter may not benefit from like 12 sets of 2 at 50%, right? A sprinter's probably going to do better in the realm of like 35 to 45, 4 sets of 6 to 8 with like shorter rest periods, right? A shot putter is going to benefit a lot more from that kind of lower volume, like more reps, or sorry, like more sets than say like a sprinter would. So, you know, don't be afraid to kind of play with it. You know, think of your athletes. I know, like I'm really big on sports specific training being like the dumbest thing in the world. It doesn't mean what people thinks it means, but this is where it like has meaning, right? Because you're going to want your athletes to adapt to the stressors that they're going to see on the field of play, and manipulating variables within this method is going to allow you to do it. So you can be faster for longer, you can recover faster in between reps, or sets rather. You know, there's a lot of benefits, and you just make it your own, right? The Westside template or a conjugate template is the thinking man's template. I've heard multiple kind of strength coaches from the generation before mine talk about that, and it really is, right? When it comes to dynamic effort method work with my very low training age athletes, like we do med ball work and jumps, right? It's the same thought process, just different kind of modalities. So don't feel like just because you have X, Y, or Z athlete, or they're, you know, whatever point in the season, or, you know, whatever it is, you can still utilize this method and see enormous benefits from it when it comes to your athlete's performance on the field. So again, it's the thinking man's template. It doesn't have to be like 10 sets of 2 or 12 sets of 2 or 7 sets of 3. It doesn't have to be those things. It doesn't have to be 50 to 60%. It does have to be heavy enough to like elicit changes, but you can make it your own. You can make it benefit your athlete more than anything else, you know, any other kind of scheme would. Like, the possibilities are limitless. So that's my take on the dynamic effort method, how I modify it for my athletes. If you want to go back and see how I modify the max effort method for my athletes, that's available on this channel as well. It's also available Spotify, Apple Podcasts, kind of everywhere you can find it. You can find it on the site for now. But, you know, like, make it your own. This template is, I think, Louis Simmons legitimately stumbled onto the best physical preparation for sport template and way to program. Like, I think he inadvertently did that when he was trying to help powerlifters get stronger, right? But this template has such like great applications when it comes to developing athletes for sport. You know, we can get bigger, we can get faster, we can get stronger, all those things all the time. And it doesn't have to just be for power lifters, and it damn sure isn't just for geared lifters. All right, so again, that's my take on the dynamic effort method. Hope you guys enjoyed this. If you have any questions, like, I'm always available. Shoot me an email. It might take me a day or two to get back to you, but I'll make sure I carve out some time to kind of sit down with you and talk about how we utilize this method here at the Lyons Den. So that's all I got for you today. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you had a good time. I know this one's like a lot longer than it typically is, which is probably a good thing that we're changing the name of this this podcast, because it no longer is the 10-minute strength pod. It's become like the 30-minute strength pod. But, you know, we'll just roll with it. Hope you guys have a good week.